constitution and imposes an increasingly oppressive rule. Cuba's communist uprising begins the next year, led by a young Fidel Castro. American politics at this point is obsessed with fears of communism, so the U.S. backs Batista in the war, no matter how brutal he becomes. And for Americans, this feels like a front in the struggle against communism. But for Cubans, it feels like Batista is an extension of American imperialism, and the guerrilla war a continuation of their long fight for freedom. And the communists win in 1959 and Castro takes power. The U.S., fearing communism's expansion, sets up the embargo to strangle Cuba's economy, tries to assassinate Castro, and even, in the disaster known as Bay of Pigs, sends in CIA-trained Cubans to try to take over the island. Castro turns to the Soviets for help, and in 1962 they nearly start World War III when the U.S. blocks Soviet efforts to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. The incident scares everyone enough that things settle into a tense but basically peaceful status quo. Over time, ordinary Cubans are squeezed between the U.S. embargo and Castro's dictatorship. In 1980, Castro tries to relieve some political dissent by briefly allowing Cubans to leave the island, and 125,000 arrive in Florida. No one realizes it at the time, but this adds a completely new dimension to the conflict. It's now also about the internal Cuban battle between Castro versus Cuban dissidents, which plays out through the U.S. joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide. Should the U.S. seize Cuba from Spain for itself, or liberate the island? This is part of a much bigger debate at the time over whether the U.S. should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba? And it ends up with a weird split baby policy, with Cuba winning independence, but other quasi-imperial American rule. The U.S. would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate Cuba's foreign policy, and give itself the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then came the American interventions in Cuba in 1906 and 1917. Each time the U.S. military takes over for a few years, ostensibly to resolve some political crisis, but that usually means protecting American interests, such as sugar imports. But today, when Americans think about the U.S. and Cuba, we think of the Cold War, but Cubans often think back to this imperial era. Now, that era technically ends in 1933 with an uprising against Cuba's government. Under U.S. law, America is supposed to intervene again, but President Franklin